Welcome. We are delighted to have you here today. We are going to be exploring business exit planning, your successful path, your strategic path to a successful transition. My name is Chris Cheney and
Paul Braham.
And we've obviously got a very special guest today, an expert in the field, somebody who's remarkably accomplished.
So a little bit about Fort Pitt. We are a boutique style investment management firm. And I think one thing that's unique about us is that we have an in-house asset management team. So we have a group of people that sit on the floor above us, actually, and they choose when to enter a position, when to exit a position. They're looking at whether a specific company is undervalued or overvalued. I just think that's really cool and unique to us. We help individuals, we help businesses, we help nonprofit organizations. We can set up 401k plans and other retirement plans. And I think for the context of this webinar, it's important to note that we do exit planning. Chris and I are both certified exit planning advisors, and we are part of a larger exit planning team here. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Our clients have come to know us for our exceptional white glove service. So I'll turn it over to Chris to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi. Again, my name is Chris Cheney. I have been with Fort Pitt Capital Group now for 18 years, but over 30 years in the business. My focus has always been on taking great care of our clients, making sure we create tailored strategies that optimize their assets so they can realize the goals for which they ultimately want to enjoy in their lives. Very involved in my local community, nonprofits. Nonprofits have always been a keen part of my life, both as a fundraiser early on in my career, and then just sitting on various boards. So it's been a privilege. Thank you.
So I'm Paul Braham, again, another financial advisor here at Fort Pitt. My intro is not going to be as long as Chris's, but I make up for it for my designations at the end of my name. I'm a certified financial planner, chartered retirement planning counselor, and like I said before, a certified exit planning advisor. Outside of work, I'm a big foodie. I love to cook, try new restaurants, spend time with my wife and English Bulldog.
Excellent. Thank you. And of course, we've got our guest today. You see him on the screen. This is Jeff Ford. We're incredibly privileged to have Jeff with us. He's a founding partner of the firm Grossman, Yannick and Ford. Jeff, just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your company.
Well, myself, we'll start with that. Outside the company, I'm extremely blessed to have a family in Westmoreland County. And I tease my wife. My running joke with my wife is it seems so much closer to Pittsburgh when we were dating than once we got married, since I grew up in the South Hills. So I'm a native Pittsburgher. Pittsburgh is near to my heart. I started the career at a firm called Deloitte with the other co-founders of GYF. We saw an opportunity to serve middle market business owners, closely held, privately held, private equity owned businesses, and we jumped off and did it. Now we're privileged to have in excess of 100 people in a full service CPA firm, audit, tax, consulting, ERP, valuation, etc. The focus today, of course, will be on transactions. We did a lot of transaction work at a predecessor firm, and that's continued to be a focus area of this firm since our inception. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, you've got quite an extensive background in it. So how many exits or transitions have you been involved with over the course of your career and the nature of those?
Well, the nature is varied, and we'll talk about it momentarily. But by way of quantity, it's hard to say. And I'll just give the example that somewhere when I was doing dispute resolution, and we do testimony, I've personally done expert testimony for purchase price disputes, working capital disputes, definition of EBITDA, etc. And in one of those cases, in the 2003, 4, 5 timeframe, the opposing counsel was challenging my credibility as an expert. And once our side showed that I had served over 100 transactions at that time, they stipulated the expertise. So it would at least be over 200 at this point, and have done a wide range of services, everything from buy-side diligence, buy-side Q of E, to sell-side Q of E, to purchase price allocations, to working capital calculations, beginning balance sheet audits, etc. So pretty broad range over a wide variety of industries over an increasing number of years.
So a broad gamut that covers pretty much the tooth to tail of the exit planning process.
Right. And it's also good to be really focused on a lot of buy-side work because it's really good to know both sides of a transaction.
Yeah, I think that's critical. We will talk about this in more detail, but obviously, the seller, there's an old saying, the seller always thinks they've got a beautiful baby, but they need to think about the business in the eyes of a buyer. And the buyer's the one who's going to look at it with the greatest degree of detail and granular attention. So having that insight is incredibly helpful to the seller. But Paul, I'll turn it over because our viewers are likely to have questions.
Perfect. So before we get into the bulk of the webinar, we're going to do a little housekeeping, how to interact. So if you are on a mobile device, down at the bottom, there is a Q&A tab right here. You can click on that and enter your question into the chat box here. If you're on a computer, you'll see that that Q&A box is just directly in the middle. So you should be able to just type in any questions you have and enter it there. So I wanted to start by addressing some of the unique challenges that business owners face. We often see that business owners don't have a formal written financial plan that addresses their personal, financial, and the business goals that they have. They're working so hard within the business that oftentimes outside of the business, gets neglected. This slide right here shows that 70%, this is as of fairly recently, the Exit Planning Institute did a study. 70% of business owners have their net worth, or 70% of their net worth is tied to the business. That's a large number there, and frequently they don't know what the value of their business is. Jeff, I do have some questions for you about valuation, but first, how in your experience are business owners different?
Well, business owners are different in a number of ways. First, in my view, business owners tend to be very committed, very driven, very energetic, very immersed in their business. I would say that while we talk a lot about generational differences, World War II versus boomers versus Gen Z versus Gen X, et cetera, my observation over the years is that business owners actually have more in common with one another across generations than they do, than they tend to reflect the characteristics of their own. So I think you have driven, immersed, tend to have deep expertise, tend to have what often would be called a type A personality.
Yeah, I would only amplify that in my experience as well, that these are people who invest themselves in whatever they do. If you like to use modern psychological phrasing, they exercise their agency to the maximum degree. And that becomes an issue when they do transition because they're used to being the driver of whatever they're involved in. And a significant hurdle can be transitioning to the second chapter. If they don't have something meaningful to go to, something that's going to continue to drive them, we oftentimes find that there's a bit of a psychological impediment that can ultimately become very disruptive. So completely agree with you on that. Yeah.
Jeff, do you notice any differences between different generations or industries specifically?
So industries have their own nuances. They certainly have different multiples of value. Certain industries lend themselves more to a strategic sale to a larger buyer. But by and large, there is more commonality than there are differences. And there are some specifically unique industries, and I'm not going to speak to local or regional banks in part because I know nothing about them. But generally speaking, businesses have a lot of commonality across industries. Generally speaking, business owners, and even when there's multiple business owners, and we'll talk a bit about the complications with that a little bit later, there's a lot of commonality. The slide that Paul and Chris have shown is true. Obviously, it's researched and it is true. I've over the years encouraged business owners from beginning to work with them through a sale to invert this slide, to really make 30% of their net worth the business and have more diversification outside the business. And that helps calm them down. That helps mute the type A personality. It helps keep it, as Clint Hurdle used to say, it helps keeps their heartbeat slower whenever they're in a contentious sale negotiation. So I'm not sure that exactly fully answers your question, Paul, but I'll turn it back to you.
No, thank you, Jeff. Back on the topic of valuation, what common blind spots or misconceptions do you see about, business owners with the value of their business?
So typically they tend to overstate the value of the business, but I want to remember at the end of this description to talk about when they understate it. Business owners tend to overstate it because they're immersed in it. Again, they've often created it. It's their beautiful baby, as Chris alluded to before. They've worked hard, and chances are it's cash flowing very well for them. Chances are it's allowed them a lifestyle that probably is in excess of what they might have achieved by doing something else. But they tend to overstate value because they often understate the importance of the dependency of the business on them. If the business is dependent upon them, the value to an outsider is less, of course. So something that they would do in the process is decrease the dependence upon them as an individual, less star power, more diversified management. The next area that's often a blind spot is concentrations. Worked with a client in that doing a sell side QofE where over 90% of their business was with one customer. It was a very good customer, of course. They believed it was a sticky customer. They believed they had good relationships, but that was a significant value challenge whenever you have that kind of concentration. And you often see 10, 20, 30, 50% concentration. Lastly, a blind spot tends to be the risk of obsolescence. Risk of obsolescence is real. Risk of obsolescence isn't just in AI or business intelligence or the things we think of. Risk of obsolescence can be a process, a product being replaced. The example is a macro example, but the ascent of Uber very quickly have the value of parking garages and even these condo parking spaces in New York City, really in just a couple of years. So the risk of obsolescence is real and much more real than many business owners perceive. Lastly, the understatement of business. Some business owners are, if you're old enough to remember Winnie the Pooh, they're Eeyore. They always think the sky is falling. And even in my business, my partners, I will lament every January, we start from zero again. So it's a common sort of Damocles type of perspective. And oftentimes, interestingly enough, when they do a sell side analysis, they fall in love again because they realize that they underestimated the value of the business and they decide that they want to stay in it after all. So I think those are a couple of varying perspectives on that.
Thank you, Jeff. And in that answer, you mentioned a QofE. Can you talk about, for those on the line that aren't aware of what that is, what it is, and also the typical financial due diligence process to determine the value of a business?
Well, the typical financial due diligence process is really multi-faceted. I'm going to actually step back from the QofE for a moment and say it's really important to assemble a team. It's important to assemble that team, excuse me, early. That team should involve lawyers, financial advisors, accountants, and others. And you should know them ahead of time. You want to have a rapport, a trust confidence report before you start. Moving from everybody else to my world, we talk financial diligence. Financial diligence really typically used to be on the buy side only. You would go in, you would test things, and that became quality of earnings reports. Test for things like those concentrations we mentioned. Look for sustainability of margins. Look for other opportunities. Look for EBITDA adjustments where you increase or decrease the EBITDA based on owner's compensation, based on other things that would be non-recurring. PPP grants, by the way, would tend to be non-recurring, and many examples of that. Somewhere in the early 2000s, there was the advent of the sell-side QofE. Sell-side QofE, or sell-side quality of earnings, was reverse of that, usually less urgent, a little more collaborative with the investment banker and the business owner. We're really seeking in a sell-side QofE to present all of these things, to make life easy for the buyer's team. We want to use it is Veterans Day. We want to grab the high ground. We want to capture the high ground before the other side picks on us. The examples that I often use include the fact that if I find something on the buy side, I tell my client, I don't tell the seller. My client then jumps up and down, and even if it's a minor issue, makes it a major negotiating point at the 11th hour. Conversely, on the sell side, you identify these issues early, and we can talk about concentrations. And if I'm going to presume opportunity to say this, but concentrations are one of the things that we really want to outline in the quality of earnings. We've talked about customer concentrations, but they're not always customer concentrations. Sometimes they're a particular product, and you want to be able to mute that discussion really as a gate before you get into the negotiations. And one of my favorite examples, because it was the most extreme, and I have to be careful because it might be too easy for some to guess, but we were doing sell-side work for a company in the Pittsburgh region, and it was pretty vanilla, pretty boring, pretty ideal. They prepared well. And when we got to the section on concentrations, no customer concentrations, they did great. And we do want to talk about the sales force. Talked about the sales force. They had 7 salespeople. It was probably somewhere in the $50 to $70 million of revenue, nothing unusual. And we said, how are the relationships spread across the salespeople? And is the relationship with the customers with the salesperson of the company? Well, it was with the salesperson. Okay, what are your means of holding those salespeople through a transaction, and what's the concentration amongst these salespeople? Well, an overwhelming majority, I think more than 3/4, was with one salesperson. That's extreme. Well, let's talk to this salesperson. Let's talk about his perspective and his loyalty through a transaction and how you might incent that financially. Well, it turns out that the salesperson was well over 70 years old. So it would have been very, very awkward to learn that in a buy side deal. So we took a few months and they really put together a game plan to not only retain this person, to have his affirmation that he wanted to work 5 more years in actually a transition plan to the other salespeople. That was invaluable when the buy side negotiations happened. Well, that's extreme, but sometimes the extreme cases are the most memorable.
That's fantastic planning. And as you've kind of pointed out, a lot of this depends upon giving yourself enough runway, enough advance time to be able to address potential issues before they arise. The last thing you want to do is, as I used to tell folks all the time, is you don't want to put your bullets together in the middle of a gunfight. It's not the time. You want to be ready beforehand. So, when we try to meet with folks, we often recommend give us 3 to 5 years in advance. Give us enough time so we can sort of identify some of those underlying issues or things that can help you to enhance the value. What I've got here right now is a slide that indicates timing. And a lot of times folks just presume that everything will come together, but there are 3 different elements of timing that we need to address and need to be aware of. You've got the personal timing process.
Yeah.
I might not be ready to retire. The 70-year-old, on the other hand, has a much shorter runway in terms of their professional, life. On the other hand, you also have a business life cycle, and most businesses go through periods of ups and downs. Obviously, ideally, if you're selling, you want to be in a position where you're on the upward side of that curve, preferably near the top, so you can maximize your sales value. And then, of course, there's the private capital markets timing, which, as everybody knows, a few years ago when money was fairly inexpensive, you can get a high multiple. Once it became much more expensive, those multiples dropped pretty sharply. So these are some of the typical timing issues that we've encountered, and obviously you've kind of identified a number of them. So I guess I'll go back a little bit and just say, what would you say distinguishes a successful exit, as we focus specifically on exits, from one that is not?
A success factor that's difficult to control is the bottom part of your slide, the capital markets. Well, I work on maybe 5 to 10 transactions a year. 2009, after the 2008 crisis, it was only one, and multiples were much lower. Thankfully, we're in the buy side that time. So I think there's things that you cannot control, but other times there is. So I think some of the keys are making sure both sides are fairly treated or perceive they're fairly treated to avoid later disputes, to avoid the seller clearly wants to avoid seller's remorse. But the seller also is an interest in the buyer not having buyer's remorse and not creating a situation where the buyer is inclined to, somehow disrupt the peaceful existence of the seller later on. Sometimes leading up to that transaction, it should not be motivated by somebody calling them and making a premium offer and then scrambling to put things together. Like Chris said, you don't want to load your bullets in the middle of the gunfight. Starting 2 to 4 years ahead of time, managing your business as if it's always for sale so that you're ready when you get that call. We don't want to sell this business, for example, but when people ask me, when would you sell? I said, well, the first stupid offer. We run this business like it's always for sale. So if somebody makes an irrational premium offer, we want to be poised to kick in the gears. By preparing ahead of time, at least 2 to 3 years ahead of time, you can be poised. You can either begin a process on your terms, or you could respond to an opportunity, back to the life cycle, back to the capital markets. It's best to move when the multiples are up, rather than whenever you're in a point of desperation or urgency. I think also when you look at values, it's good to have time to what I call get used to the situation, have the time to move towards objective realism. Objective realism isn't usually there at the beginning. We talked a little while ago about blind spots of value. Those are real, but there's another more qualitative component of that. The qualitative component of that is just perception. I make the joke, and I'm gonna have to have a new one as people don't use checks anymore. I make the joke that the same number looks a lot bigger if you're signing the front of the check versus the back of the check. So the objective realism is important. Also, with the same business owner, I would laugh because I would say in the early conversations, what is the value? And they talk as if they're talking to their lender, and it's a big value. I said, well, on the other hand, what if it was your spouse's divorce lawyer? What would you say of the value then? And it's amazing to me how different they are. I say, well, okay, I get the competing goals, but now let's take a little time and let's work towards realism. So there's a lot of things involved, getting to know your team, understanding your business. It's really important to become an informed consumer of the process. It's important when you go to an auto mechanic to understand the components of a car. You're a more informed consumer. I would encourage business owners to become an informed consumer of the transition and transaction process.
You've kind of touched on this a couple of times, but there are a number of key risks that can really disrupt a successful exit. Just to momentarily focus on some of those, if you are watching, I would strongly recommend that you take a look at this list because it's pretty comprehensive. Any one of these can destroy the value of your company or severely disrupt it. Jeff kind of touched on, for instance, disruption. Disruption would be that issue of obsolescence, unanticipated obsolescence. It can blindside you. The diversification issue, the ideas of concentration. If the entire business depends upon, is rested upon the shoulders of one person, and that person walks out the door, there's nothing to transfer. There is no value to the business. So a lot of these, if we have enough time, need to be addressed in advance. This is a particular area where it's really important, as Jeff pointed out, to have an attorney on the team who can address some of these issues in advance with various agreements. But obviously, a lot of these don't get addressed. So I guess this goes back to a question, sort of, we talked about successful exits, but what remedies would you have when you've got an unsuccessful exit?
I think the unsuccessful exit, or one that's looking to be unsuccessful, I think there's, even before you have an unsuccessful exit, I believe you should always have a plan B. You should always be willing to leave, to walk away, to fight another day. If you were going to sell a pancake chain and you wanted to do it and it looked good and you were going to do it in 2025, the maple syrup tariff would have been a disruption that would have changed your game plan, for example. And I'm going to assert that very few, if any, people would have expected in 2023 a maple syrup tariff in 2025. So one always has to be ready with a plan B. So I think in that regard, being realistic, taking some time, getting used to the situation, not becoming euphoric. Sometimes an unsuccessful transaction happens because the owner sells in their mind before the transaction. So when I do buy-side diligence, the buyer knows that the highest dollar amount is that on the letter of intent. And my job sometimes is to help them whittle that number down from that on the letter of intent to whatever the amount is at closing. I'm doing sell-side work is to defend that. So if that whittles down too much, that then becomes an unsuccessful exit for the seller. So being prepared to defend it, not having buyer's euphoria, being willing to walk away, as the old adage goes, if you're not willing to walk away, you're not really negotiating. And this is, in fact, a negotiation. And sellers sometimes are experiencing this. They might have bought several companies. You're only selling one. They might have bought several. So they are good at this. They're good at spotting whenever you've essentially emotionally committed to the sale. They are good at spotting whenever your management team has already essentially mailed it in and they're not running through the finish line. So I think those are some things to think about. Other things are often just driven by value. Back to that side of the check thing. Value tends to be the biggest reason deals fall apart, or the biggest reason people are unhappy with it. I thought it was going to get more. Maybe I paid too much on the buy side. So there has to be some creativity. If you want to keep the deal alive and you can't agree on value, there are certainly tools. So we're not going to cover all of them this afternoon, but amongst them, of course, is seller financing. I think to be successful, the seller has to be happy, as a now deceased but just fabulous client of mine from years ago taught me, that the seller needs to be happy with what they walk away with at closing. All the contingent money is gravy. So seller financing can be really important. Typically, it shouldn't be the lion's share of the deal, but it can get a deal done that wouldn't otherwise get done. Even more common, particularly the larger the transaction is, the smaller the transaction, the more it's going to be seller financing. The larger the transaction is going to be focused on a couple of other things, either contingent consideration or some rollover of ownership. The owner should also be thinking whether they want to truly exit or whether they want to be in for the second bite of the apple, so to speak. So maybe you roll over 10% into the new company, and oftentimes the buyers want that. They see high value in that, and oftentimes the payoff might be even more with that last 10 to 20% than it was with the first, more significant chunk of it. So I think the ability to consider rollover, equity, and then lastly, the true contingent consideration. Contingent consideration is usually dependent upon either future sales achievement, maintenance of certain things, most common achieving EBITDA for basically a 1 to 2 year period. So maybe you get X% of EBITDA achievements in year 1 and Y% in year 2. And then that juices the deal to a point where the seller is happy if it's achieved, but the buyer's not feeling overcommitted or overspending up front. Some creativity, some effort there is really important. The most creative story I remember is working as a team with a really excellent lawyer and a really excellent president of a company and a very sophisticated seller, where the buyer was a European publicly traded company. They didn't want to overpay. They did not want to disclose this foray into the United States before it was already a proven success. That was a big impediment to the deal. So amazingly enough, this was structured as a 7-year pure contingent transaction with 5 measurement points, where the trigger of recognition and consolidation didn't happen to successful passing of the third one. That's extreme, as I mentioned, with a 70-something salesperson. The extreme examples sometimes are more memorable. So I do remember that one very vividly.
Well, I think, Jeff, you've also illustrated something that's incredibly important for the person who might be listening, the business owner who's attending this. This might be the only time they have that conversation. Maybe they've had it once or twice before. You've had it myriad times. You mentioned over 200. That's incredibly important, because you're going to see issues that they can't anticipate. You're going to anticipate problems that are off their radar, and you're going to see potential solutions, oftentimes like the one you just mentioned, that are incredibly creative, that will help them find a way forward. Because the goal is always to get to the optimal result, which again doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer gets the most or the seller gets the most, because again, they both have to be happy with the outcome. But the fact that you've been able to go through this myriad times means getting you involved in the process as early as possible is really important.
And having a team that's willing to walk away. Sometimes it falls apart for more boring reasons. So you learn from that, you step back, and you go back to market 1 year later. You fix it and you go back to market.
And oftentimes get a better result. I keep thinking of an example that's very common for most folks is, when you're looking for a house, you fall in love with a house and you'll start to give away the store trying to get that one house, not realizing there's another great house right around the corner. As you said, being willing to walk away gives you leverage. Without it, you don't have it.
And not every member of your team is willing to walk away. Sometimes the business brokers or investment bankers, or they are rewarded on closing. So some of them more than others have a zeal for close, and will be willing to drop the standards a little bit on what you achieve in order to achieve a close. And sometimes it helps you a lot, because maybe the future wouldn't have been well for you. But if Fort Pitt allows me one more story that just came to my mind when Chris said that, I'm certainly not always right. I learned certainly more from my mistakes and successes. And one of the ones where this client continues to tease me, it was a technology company, and they had a startup. They were pre-revenue and they were offered $25 million cash. I was in the conference room when the buyer offered that, a large public company offered it. And my client turned them down. There were 2 primary shareholders, 2 founders. And he said that I did not keep a poker face at all on the expression I gave when he turned down 25 million pre-revenue. So it came around again a few years later after they were commercialized, and they had an offer for $75 to $80 million. And at that point, I had confidence in him. I said, well, if you're still in the game, you could wait. Otherwise, this is a great exit. He said, I think I'm still in the game. I'm going to keep on going. Investment bankers then were feeling betrayed, actually. They saw a fee on a $75 million exit. He sold then the majority for $125 million. We just talked about rollover equity. He rolled over a certain percent. The next sale exceeded $1 billion. So if he had actually taken my advice early on, he would have ended up with 50% of 25 million. So sometimes, the business owner has to have the long term. They have to be thoughtful, and sometimes, recognize your advisors aren't always right.
To your point, I've often seen, and this can happen with the investment bankers or the business brokers. I've noticed that they're sometimes so eager to get the date that they will state the value of a company, overstate the value of what they can do in order to make sure that they get the engagement. And that can set up, the problem is that our sense of what constitutes success is defined by expectations. And managing expectations becomes incredibly important. to your point, you just gave a great example of somebody who had higher expectations and as a result did achieve incredible success. I've also seen the opposite where somebody had inflated expectations, received an offer that was half or less, and then you've got to deal with disappointment.
Well, we're dealing with one in that light right now on the buy side, not the sell side, but they're highly similar. Great looking opportunity, seemingly capable investment banker, seemingly capable SIM, seemingly credible sell side Q of E. We're in the deep into the buy side diligence side, and it's very clear that the information was not up to snuff, and it's moving toward a delay in the transaction, and actually the buyer being highly upset with the seller's investment banker, and obviously not my firm in this case, because we stay in our lane, but there is a lot of interesting legal exchanges right now based on the information that was conveyed, based on the information as it turned out to be.
Yeah, that is definitely something we want to avoid for sure. One of the key goals of transition planning is to make sure that you maximize the value, you minimize the regret, and making sure that you've got a really strong team. And as Paul said earlier, address both the business, the personal financial side, and the life after business, which, as soft as that may sound, is incredibly important, because if you're not able to make that psychological transition to a new stage in your life, I have seen people walk away from the abyss, undermine a deal, simply because they couldn't make that transition. What we want to do is maximize the value. And to do that, Jeff's already pointed out multiple times, and we go back to that list of the 7 Ds of value destruction. You've got to mitigate risk. That's your first step. You always should be mitigating risk, but seeing risk from a buyer's side will illumine the issue in a way that oftentimes just seeing it even from a management side doesn't. Once you've done that, once you've really thoroughly addressed it, and having somebody who's got Jeff's expertise and insight really helps, then you can focus on accelerating growth, on building those areas in the business that will hopefully amplify that growth over time. So this all kind of addresses the front end, but part of the planning process is taxes. Taxes are a key consideration, and one of the things Jeff is incredibly expert at. So
yeah, taxes are always a concern. Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the differences between an asset sale and a stock sale? And from a tax perspective, why the seller and buyer interests are often opposed there?
Yeah, they're actually most often opposed, Paul. So that's a good observation, a good insight. A stock sale is really lovely for the seller. Not only do they sell all the skeletons in their closet, so to speak, but they also get likely full capital gain treatment on the sale. So if you have $100 million sale and you virtually had nothing invested in it because you're extreme case again, but basis of zero, you'll pay, and you're materially involved in the business, you might have a 20% federal tax on that, $20 million. Still a lot, but a lot less than 37 million. So the seller loves a stock sale. The buyer does not like a stock sale for several reasons. Number one, the legal side, they don't like to inherit the unknown skeletons in your closet. But we're focusing on the financial, and the financial is profound to the buyer. If I buy stock as a buyer, I get what's called a step up. I don't get to amortize that. I don't get to deduct any part of my selling cost. It merely becomes my basis for when I sell it. So maybe if I have contracts that I can't transfer or something critical, maybe I hold my nose and do it anyway, or I might have some reason to do it, or we adjust the value to do it. But what happens when you buy assets are some things that are extremely helpful. I get to step them up. I get to reset the productive assets. Let's say you have a lot of plant and equipment because you're a manufacturer. They're set at fair market value. And right now, because of the, I can't remember all the initials, the One Big Beautiful Act situation in July, we can still take 100% bonus depreciation on that. So we immediately write off that purchase for that plant and equipment in large measure, subject, of course, to limitations, as there always are limitations. Similarly, let's say there's a lot of goodwill. Let's say we buy a technology company, there's very little assets or some desk chairs and computers, but most of the value is in the software and the customer base or something like that. We're at least amortizing that over 15 years versus never. So the asset buy is just very, very, very helpful to the buyer. But what it does to the seller is that if you're a C corp, it's effectively no different. If you are a pass-through entity, a seller, most sellers are pass-through entities, an LLC taxed as a partnership or an S corp or something along those lines, then all of those assets are going to be segregated that are sold. Some of them will be capital gains, some will be ordinary income, and sellers hate what's called recapture. All of the accelerated depreciation you took against ordinary income is what's called recaptured. Again, I'm oversimplifying. There are some nuances to it. That depreciation is recaptured, and that part of your gain is taxed at ordinary rates, even if the asset and the remainder of it is a capital item like a machine or a production facility. So there's a lot of complications to that, but the short version of the story is asset buy is really, really important to the seller and something that to the buyer, and the seller needs to be aware of the financial ramifications of that.
Thanks for that, Jeff. I think that was helpful. What about small business owners? Are there any unique opportunities or exemptions that they might want to explore or be attentive to?
Well, there are several, and again, I'm already recognizing, and some on the video may be recognizing that I could probably talk 3 hours on any of these questions. So we're going to try and be succinct about the qualified small business stock. That's a great opportunity for small business owners, and it was expanded in July. It has been there for a long time, but the short version of the story is it allows the stockholder, the seller, to exclude up to 100% of their capital gain with certain limitations. Those limitations have been expanded from a $10 million gain to 15 now, again, depending on the date, the situation, the issue of the stock. You do, in fact, have to be a C corp or an LLC taxed as a C corp. You can't be an S corp or a partnership. But you can also, it also limits, again, the first 15 million of your gain, but you also have to be under 75 million of net assets or gross assets, not net assets. And it has to be under 10 times your basis. Sometimes the 10 times the basis is a limiting factor, but you should look at the situation because when it works, it is extremely helpful. Now, many industries are excluded. So before you cash your chips in your mind, so to speak, remember that many businesses like professional service agencies, accounting firms, the three of us on this call, our businesses would be excluded from that treatment by nature of the businesses. Medical practices, et cetera, are excluded from that. So one has to be careful, but it's worth looking at. And there are other things along those lines as well. And sometimes they're not always federal. We're focusing on federal today because all sales have the federal oversight in common, but there are also other programs state by state that should be looked at.
Perfect. Appreciate that. And we hear a lot about employee stock ownership plans lately,
Sure.
or ESOPs. When, in your experience, does that make sense?
So ESOPs have been around a long time, and they are very, very, very helpful for a somewhat small sliver of opportunities. But if you're in that sliver, it is really hard to beat certain aspects of an ESOP. Too many people think of an ESOP like Weirton Steel, where it was big, and if the ESOP is your buyer of last resort, is probably going to fail. So be thinking of fairness. You still need fair value. You still need a viable business. You still need the business to cash flow after the ESOP transaction. Very, very important. But there are different flavors of ESOPs for sure, and you should be talking to an ESOP expert. And while I'm going to dangerously tread, and I have a partner who's an expert in ESOPs, but she's coached me well, and I've observed her well. There's a thing called a 1042 election where a C corp ESOP, a C corp company moving to an ESOP, the seller can actually defer their gain so long as they reinvest it in a qualified business. And there's definitions of that. 80% of that business has to be in the act of commerce or whatever that business is and so forth. And you can read down a checklist. Checklists tend to be highly analogous to that for employee versus independent contractor, tend to be a long list of criteria. And some of them are much more bright lines or clear than others. And many of them are open to interpretation or the opportunity to manage a little bit. Back to the runway Chris and Paul talked about, with a little runway that can be managed a little bit. So that's an amazing opportunity when you have the right profile or when you have enough runway to convert to a C corp and move in that direction.
Yeah, a little shout out to your partner. That would be Melissa Bijak.
Yeah, Melissa Bijak for sure.
Absolutely fantastic. One of the best in the area. Just
yeah,
terrific.
Melissa is actually nationally recognized in the ESOP community, so there are a few better. But ESOPs can also be very valuable if you're not a C corp. They don't have to be 100%. They could be partial. There's things to be gained with leveraged ESOPs. Again, it's its own area of art that should be on the table when one is considering an exit, even though most will take it off the table before you sell. If it works, it can be a magnificent opportunity.
And you mentioned that's for, a very specific situation. What about, just in general, some owners that want to minimize or mitigate taxes whenever they sell?
Well, remember we talked about contingent consideration. If you couldn't get all the money you wanted up front because the buyer thought that you wanted too much money and you thought that they were giving you too little. So we talked about some of the money being paid in year two, 1, 2, 3 years after the transaction. Then you have the opportunity to do what's called installment sales treatment, where you're kind of recognizing, not kind of, you are recognizing your gain, obviously subject to certain limitations, ratably over the period you receive it. So you recognize your gain when you get it. People do, and I see obviously on the slide, the charitable giving. Just like the other nuances that Chris talked about with the business owners and sometimes seller's remorse, it's not running to something. The fact that somebody is used to having control, sometimes for decades, they're used to being the one that really drives the decisions. They're the final, the buck stops there, as Harry Truman would say. Sometimes if they're still obsessed with control, this next one is less operative to them. Charitable giving, whether it's a remainder trust, a lead trust, other trusts, any number of vehicles on the charitable side, can be very, very helpful. And when owners have been emotionally ready for that, and whenever they've already taken care of their family, so to speak, it can be extremely helpful. Where I've seen it not work in both directions is a couple of cases where they did a very large gift to a charity. The owner mistakenly thought they would have continuing influence, which they did for a little while. That eroded. The owner was very, very frustrated and disappointed that the charity stopped listening to their views a handful of years later. Even at my alma mater, which I'm proud of, at Duquesne, I will shout it out. If Chris Cheney funded a building now, that Cheney School of Financial Planning might be renamed the Braham School of Financial Planning 20 years later with a larger gift. So business owners have to recognize that control, in fact, goes away. The other thing that often happens is ahead of time, they will put a lot of the business interest in trust for their children or for somebody else. Some business owners want to put a limit on the money that the children have. Maybe it's a handful of million, maybe it's not. Sometimes the business is sold for a lot more than that. And one case where they thought, and I realize I sometimes talk too much, but in quickly, the example there is a case where the two owners set up trusts for their multiple children, wanting the target to be $10 to $20 million of value for each child, which is a lot of money. The business just blossomed to where the value for each child now is between 2 and 300 million after taxes. They're having remorse, too much for the kids. We want to do more for charity. And I don't know the nuances of the tax side of estate planning, but they actually have to have the estate planning attorney have their child sign a letter to cede that right. And I said to them, that's an interesting conversation. I wanted you to have 10 million, Paul. Well, now you have 300, but I don't want you to have the 300. Will you give 250 of it back so I could give it to charity? Well, again, maybe on a tangent, but that's back to planning, thinking, understanding with realism. But charitable giving is a really important part of your tax planning. Just think about the permanence of it as you begin to execute it.
Yeah, along those lines, and we often do webinars. I've done quite a few on charitable giving. There are two things to keep in mind. One, any charitable planning you want to do before a sale should happen before the letter of intent. That's number one. Number two, to Jeff's point, it's nice to give away a sizable chunk. We actually oftentimes prefer to look at things like charitable trusts or other types of entities where you might have a little more control over the eventual disposition of the charitable assets. Just something to keep in mind. We do have a couple questions that popped up during the conversation. One of which is, you mentioned some options available to the small business owner with a C corp or the LLC. What about somebody? Typically we do see a lot of owners with S corp or pass through. Do you have strategies that you recommend to help mitigate some of the tax consequences for them?
Or there's certainly strategies, and moving towards emphasizing the capital gain treatment is the best. I'm not aware or can't think of any right now off the top of my head that are statutorily enacted avoidance of capital gains. So that's kind of a very specific thing to a very specific situation. So rather than save a whole bunch in one place, our strategy for the pass-through entities tends to be to save 2 to 5% in several places. And yes, there are strategies to do that. That usually involves looking at the situation, outlining what the structure of the sale would look like, outlining what would be installment, what would be early, what would be recapture, what wouldn't. So we actually do a model in advance and say, if the terms of the sale were this, what would the outcome be? If the terms were that, what would the outcome be then? So it tends to be involve a little more modeling, but for sure you want to be looking pretty closely at that.
All of these tend to presume, of course, a buyer outside the family, but a buyer
Mhm.
who's trying to transition to the next generation is going to have different considerations. They want to ensure that the next generation is going to receive not only a viable business, but hopefully at a reasonable cost that still gives them the cash flow they need to realize their retirement goals. You know, how, when you're dealing with an interfamily or intergenerational transfer, you know, what approaches do you tend to take at a time like that? How do you tend to look at that?
Well, I think as you have alluded to, they're far more complex for a number of reasons. First of all, oftentimes you have, you're moving from second to third generation. So maybe you have two current owners, each with multiple people in the next generation. Who can run the company? What rights do the non-participating shareholders have when you move it, down the chain one more time? Non-participating shareholders tend to believe they often deserve more from the annual cash flows. Participating shareholders tend to believe that more of that should be a bonus. That's something that I think, or we think, is best dealt with ahead of time and with agreement. Also, they're not all ready at the same time. If Chris and Paul were siblings and Chris was ready to pass it to his next generation and Paul wasn't, it's sometimes very, very difficult. I think it's important to have essentially a game plan for that. What will we do? How will we deal with this? Sometimes it's delayed too long, it becomes awkward. I'm not a follower of the royals, but in my observation, now King Charles waited a long time to move to the adult table. Sometimes your plan of moving to the next generation is actually foiled because you waited too long. You're 85 years old, your child is now, 60 something, they have children and grandchildren, and your plan is foiled because of your whatever procrastination or informed delay. So I think there's innumerable complexities when you're moving it in interfamily. And then lastly, and most sadly, is when there's dissension. We've worked with companies where two founding brothers could no longer, that thankfully that for them, their manufacturing operation at a campus, they literally built two office buildings, two separate controllers, and stayed, several hundred yards apart from one another. Moving from them to the next generation became impossible. They wanted to, but were left with the need to sell to an outside party. So when there's contention, it's very hard to have a return. So the advice is deal with it, agree upon a plan before there's contention.
You've touched on a couple things that I've seen repeatedly over my career, and that is, first of all, it's very rare to have a second generation pass to a third generation, rarer still to the next generation. The numbers that actually transfer at that point are very small. But nonetheless, you have multiple heirs. And the question is, how do you give them some kind of equitable value? And you've already pointed out, and it's worth just reiterating, the people who receive an income benefit, oftentimes have non-voting stock. You can split the stock into voting and non-voting. They want to maximize that cash flow. That's the only interest they get from the business. Meanwhile, the business owner is very interested. The one who inherits the actual operation is intent on maximizing the value of the business. So the last thing they want to distribute is tons of cash flow out of the business. So they're oftentimes, with adequate planning, you can mitigate a lot of those inevitable built-in sources of friction, but it really means working with a team. And I think that's one of the things that we really want to kind of identify as people begin to think about, hey, I'm thinking about an exit. Here are the things we need to do. This just kind of outlines some of the key steps. Obviously, completing an evaluation of the business is critical. You need to have a good starting point. Jeff, I know that's part of what your firm already does, is they do a lot of business valuations.
Yes, and again, you mentioned Melissa on the ESOP side. She does lead our valuation group, and valuations are multi-purpose as well. Are you doing a more simple, less costly calculation of value that usually fits this circumstance? If you get to a point of contention, you're doing a much more kind of litigation-ready valuation, which is much more extensive and much more challenging. And I think having that game plan, thinking about it ahead of time, having the team, we're reiterating things, even in the multi-generation, it came to mind that my bias is that instead of having multiple non-participating and participating shareholders, I usually have a bias towards encouraging the participating shareholder to buy out the other one so that we minimize the number of shareholders. So I will say guard your equity very vigorously, guard it very, very, very strongly. And then, plan ahead of time. And everything you see on this slide is, very, very good advice, by the way. Contingency planning the whole way down, very good advice.
A lot of this is just part of the process of de-risking the business and de-risking your plan. And as Jeff, as you pointed out, having a backup. If you go through each of these steps, you actually will have all the backups in place that you need, and you'll be very aware of what you actually require to have, as we said, a successful exit. Knowing what the potential tax consequence is in advance. Now, obviously, that depends on the structure of the deal, but knowing what the potential tax consequence is going to look like, working with a financial advisor who could say, will this be sufficient to meet my needs? Will this cover the gap? There's often what we call a magic number. How much do I actually need in total assets to be able to realize my retirement goals, or at least my next step in life? Identifying key stakeholders, that is a critical process. One of the things you alluded to earlier, Jeff, is when you're going through an exit, these are demanding. They can be like an endurance test. You're trying to go through the process of an exit. It's very detailed. You're doing the due diligence, the legal due diligence, the accounting due diligence, everything, and at the same time still run a successful business and never take your eye off the ball. It can be exhausting, and I've seen people give away money at the end just because of exhaustion. But making sure you identify and get the buy-in from the key stakeholders is important. Usually that's something you do a little further down the road. You obviously want to keep all of this highly confidential until you get to the point where you're ready, what we call rug cutting time. At that point, then it's just before you get there, it's time to make sure you've got the key buy-ins, as you pointed out with that one sales executive, and having contingency plans just in case. So each of these are important. So just to kind of bring it together, what are the top three things in your mind that an owner absolutely should do, but typically doesn't?
What they should do, but typically doesn't, is take time to prepare. You mentioned the exhaustion. It is like a marathon. I actually admit I cannot go run a marathon. But if you gave me 2 years to prepare and I train, I probably could, presumably. So I think if the business owner has time to prepare and trains, this is essentially financial training and business training, they achieve it. They have to look at their own team. Their team probably has some weaknesses. They need to de-risk, as you mentioned. Sometimes de-risking is part of their team. They need to supplement it. Maybe they supplement it with people like us. Maybe they supplement it in other means, but they need to have maneuvering time to do that. Back to that realism, they need to look at contingencies. They need to mitigate the obsolescence. They need to decide whether they need to hurry or whether they can be patient. They need to train themselves to be dispassionate, objective, clinical dispassion. You don't want the blood in the water moment from the other team. So objective, dispassionate, clinical, willing to do something else, willing to walk away. And part of the training, back to the very early slide, is taking more and more of your net worth along the way out of this business. Make yourself able to negotiate with clarity and self-interest while still achieving fairness. Fairness, understanding value, understanding the ability to be creative if you need to, and then identify a buyer that you can respect. Sellers struggle if they do not respect the buyer, or they do not respect how that buyer will treat their people. So that was more than 3 things. There they were anyway.
Yeah, that's excellent. I guess the flip side of that is what do owners do that they just shouldn't do?
They get euphoric. They get in a hurry. They're sitting in a golf outing and someone says, "Oh, I got 12 times EBITDA from a business just like yours." Well, first of all, people exaggerate. I learned a long time ago, because we do see the tax returns. I remember a long time ago, I've heard people, and we are obsessive with confidentiality of our clients. I was amused by the income people told others they made versus the income that they actually really made. So just because someone tells you they got 13 times EBITDA doesn't mean they did. It doesn't, it might have been with the high end of the contingent outcomes. So I think not becoming silly, not becoming demanding, not becoming in a hurry, not thinking I will only sell to this time. I think something they also shouldn't do is back to that charitable giving. It can be very analogous with regard to sale to business. Thinking because you were the founder, you can still walk in 2 owners later and say, I always had the stamping press over here, not over there. I mean, these things actually happen and they should not be done. And sometimes, and the owner should vet his team ahead of time. An example, very good friends, very successful exit. Somebody in his team who had a small amount of stock basically held 5%, which I guess is meaningful, held the deal hostage at the 11th hour for an extra $2 million bonus because they wouldn't sign. And this agreement didn't have drag along provisions and all those other legal things that you need to build in as part of that multi-year planning. And then lastly, what an owner shouldn't do is they shouldn't give away too much too easily. So if I'm going to sell to Chris and I'm afraid that Chris might flip my business 1 year later and triple his money, I need to think about something like a clawback. How can I get a little of that gain back? So the shouldn't do's are don't rush into it. Don't give away too much too easy. Be realistic. Don't confuse. Don't delude yourself to thinking you'll have any influence whatsoever at the moment after you sign that agreement.
Jeff, thank you. This has been incredibly helpful. We've actually tried to address some of the questions that have arisen during the course of the webinar throughout it. So Paul, I guess I will actually press this and go forward just past the next Q&A. Paul, what's the next step?
Yeah, so next step is to give us a call. We do free consultations to go over your goals, your situation, and we can address some of the things that we talked about today. Here you'll see the link to our blog to find more of past webinars, blog posts, and more expert advice. Certainly, if you have any questions that weren't addressed today, feel free to reach out to us directly. We have our contact information here.
And one last thing, Jeff, how does somebody move forward with you if they realize this is what they need?
Appreciate it. The easiest way is Ford, F-O-R-D, at gyf.com, initials of the firm, Ford at gyf.com. And we too would be very happy to make an acquaintance and have preliminary discussions.
Well, thank you, Jeff. We really appreciate your time. This has been incredibly insightful. We've had quite a number of people respond here and appreciate what you've done. And again, anyone who has an interest, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to serve you. Our goal is to help you make the most of your assets and achieve the most successful outcome possible. We're grateful for your time today and look forward to following up soon. Take care. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.